Okay, well, we probably should begin. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Benjamin Jones. I'm a lecturer of history here at CQU, and I'd like to begin by paying my respect to the traditional owners of this land, and also in Mackay and Sydney and all over Australia, wherever you may be listening from, but especially for those of us here in Rockhampton. I'd like to pay my respects to the Durrumbul elders, past, present and emerging. When Dr. Anna Stevenson emailed to ask if she could speak at CQU about her new book, I jumped at the opportunity. She's an exceptional historian, primarily concerned with feminism and women's social movements in Australia, South Africa and the United States. Her work has truly global reach, and she's very much the modern international academic, having been based just in the past few years in Canberra, Brisbane, Boston, Northampton, Pittsburgh, Melbourne, and now Bloemfontein, where she's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of the Free State in South Africa. But she is from Rockhampton and CQU alumna, and we take no small pride in her stunning success. She completed her PhD at the University of Queensland in 2015, looking at 19th century social reform, especially feminist rhetoric, and she deftly problematises the use of the woman-slave analogy in feminist rhetoric. 2019 has been a tremendous year for Anna. She was awarded the prestigious W. Terentine Jackson Prize and the Covert Award in Mass Communication History. Her first monograph, The Woman as Slave in 19th Century American Social Movements, will be published shortly by Palgrave Macmillan. And of course, the reason we're here is to discuss her edited collection with Alana Piper, Gender Violence in Australian Historical Perspectives. And this work sits right at the crossroads of politics and history, and really demonstrates the crucial role that history has to play in unpacking and interpreting cultural and societal issues. And I think it's in the spirit of Joe Gouldy and David Armitage's History Manifesto, which calls for an increased role of history in contemporary society and public debate. The History Manifesto challenges historians to use their expertise, their methods, and their voice to speak truth to power, and Anna's book does exactly that. Her introduction concludes with a powerful sentence: "This history is a rallying cry." So I commend the book to you and would like to invite Associate Professor Celeste Dawson, our Head of Professional Communications, to say a few words.
Thank you, Ben. I would like to, on behalf of the university, like to welcome Dr. Anna Stevenson back home here to CQU. As Ben mentioned, Anna graduated with a Bachelor of Communication in 2008, so we will claim that. Welcome home. And I would also like to acknowledge the people, the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today. For us here in Rockhampton, it's the Durrumbul people. And I'd like to welcome everybody for being here. I noticed the Mayor, Margaret Strelo, in the audience today. Welcome. And welcome to all of our colleagues here in Rockhampton and in other locations. I'd like to acknowledge the link we're making to Mackay today. We have the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research based in Mackay, and there is a strong link between the work that Anna is writing and researching about and the domestic violence research that we're conducting here at CQU. One of the, when I was had the opportunity to have a look at Anna's book, one of the areas that was particularly interesting to me was your chapter 12, and I know that the book itself, and Ben has done a lovely summary of that, is about the historical perspectives of gender violence in Australia. It's a very brave topic to be researching, and one that's very necessary and welcome, I think, in today's society. In your chapter 12 in your book, you touch on something that's interesting to me. I'm the head of course for professional communication, and we look at social media and the future of the way that people progress and express themselves in social media. And one of the things that you talk about is looking at the nature of gendered violence through the lens of the modern technology and social media. And from my perspective, that's a fantastic way of drawing in the skills that you've got from communication and journalism with the nature of violence and how we speak about that as a society. And I know that we talk about, with my students, we talk about the social media campaigns that I'm sure we're all familiar with, like the Me Too campaign or the Let Her Speak campaign, and it shows just how much speaking there is to be done in this space, but also how far we have come in this space. So I am really looking forward to Anna's talk today, and I would like to, on behalf of the university and also in my capacity as chair of the academic board at Central Queensland University, I would like to formally welcome Dr. Anna Stevenson to university today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for such a warm welcome. It's so lovely to be back at CQ University. I really love this campus. I believe I took lectures in this lecture theatre, which were video linked through to Mackay as well. So it's a bit of deja vu. So I'd like to also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather, the Darumbal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you so much to the Mayor, Margaret Striolo, for taking the time to attend today. And my special thanks to Dr. Benjamin Jones and Mark Barnborn and everyone else who helped facilitate my visit today. I very much appreciate it. I really appreciate the support that you've all placed in this research, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to share it with you. But before I get into the book itself, I would like to also pay a debt of gratitude to CQ University, because before I came to CQ University, I didn't know what an edited collection was. So I'm pleased to be able to share with you my edited collection after learning about the nature of the edited collection through this excellent book, Shakespeare the Movie. I took the course here. When I first got this as the textbook, I'm like, what is this? It's so interesting. There's so many different chapters with all these different authors. It's on topics that are different but also similar. So it's very exciting to be here to talk about my own edited collection. So the book project had unusual beginnings. It started as a 16-part blog series that I organised with my friend and colleague Alana Piper across November and December 2016. As managing editors of VIDA, blog of the Australian Women's History Network, we brought this series together in order to acknowledge and raise awareness about the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Established in 1991 by the Centre for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University in the United States, this global campaign seeks to raise awareness about gender-based violence as a human rights issue at the local, regional, national and international levels. It has become what the Centre describes as the longest-running campaign for women's rights in the world. As the campaign itself notes, more than 6,000 organisations in more than 185 countries have participated since 1991, which has had an estimated reach of over 300 million people worldwide. Our initial VIDA blog series contributed to this campaign in 2016 by sharing histories of gender violence from the early modern era to the present, focusing predominantly on Australia but also extending to Europe and the Asia-Pacific region. It explored topics such as domestic violence, child sexual abuse, psychic violence, economic abuse, communal violence and state violence, as well as the long history of feminist activism against gender violence. For me, this was an incredibly eye-opening experience because prior to this, gender violence was not something that I'd really focused on in my own research. This was because much of my own research is about activist women's history, especially during the 19th century. So while I was certainly aware of the issues that the campaign touched on, I had mainly focused on the ways in which 19th century women's rights reformers had responded to violence against women. These reformers sought to ameliorate problems relating to wife beating and women's lack of bodily autonomy, especially in marriage. But this isn't something that I focused on personally. As a result, at every point in the process, from editing the initial blog series to bringing it together as an edited collection with Alana Piper, I found these histories to be incredibly confronting, beginning to consider the situation not from the outlook of activists, but from the viewpoint of those who are affected by gender violence, offers a wholly new perspective. This has put me in the privileged position of being able to help facilitate this new scholarship. Our edited collection brings together the work of historians who have long addressed aspects of this topic in their own research, and in doing so, our collection contributes to constructing a history of gender violence in Australia from the 19th century to the present. The result, however, is that these histories do not necessarily produce a comforting narrative. The story arc is not that social progress has gradually led to the amelioration of gender-based violence. Activism against gender violence has certainly been ongoing, especially since the 1970s, but delving into these histories can be a discomforting experience as much as a profoundly emotional one. This is to say that I would like to issue a blanket trigger warning for today's presentation. My presentation will touch on topics that are historical as much as they are contemporary, urgent, and ongoing. I will also show some images, albeit briefly, that some in the audience may find to be disturbing. But these histories also reveal that gender violence is a far from historically inescapable phenomenon. Our collection confirms that gender violence comes in many forms, all of which are endemic and interconnected, but, most importantly, are able to be challenged. In 2015, the Australian federal government proclaimed that violence against women had become a national crisis. Despite widespread social and economic advances in the status of women since the 1970s, the prevalence of gender violence remains alarming. As of 2015, a third of all women in Australia have been assaulted physically, while a fifth have been assaulted sexually. One woman each week is murdered by an intimate partner. Domestic violence is a precipitating factor in a third of all homelessness, and recent research suggests that nearly 40% of all women who suicide have a history of domestic or family violence. The resulting strain on government services means that family violence has been estimated to cost the Australian economy around $13.6 billion annually. Research further suggests that, like other forms of gender violence, the vast majority of sexual assaults continue to remain unreported. Even so, the Australian Bureau of Statistics reported in 2016 that nearly a fifth of all adult women had been sexually harassed in the previous year, while over a half had experienced sexual harassment at some point in their lives. A 2017 report by the Australian Human Rights Commission uncovered overwhelming levels of sexual assault and sexual harassment and assault across the nation's universities. And these experiences are by no means limited to cisgender women. A 2012 study suggested that nearly half of all gay, lesbian, and transgender people in Australia hide their sexuality or gender identity. According to the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society, this is for fear of experiencing heterosexist violence or discrimination in public. Men, though statistically at less risk, can also become the victims of family or sexual violence, with their abusers often being other men. Criminologist Michael Salter suggests that the minimisation and disbelief that is typically faced by women who experience gender-based violence should be understood as another type of abuse in itself, one that has serious physical and mental health effects. Gender violence has thus seemed to have reached a particularly significant historical moment. At the same time, it has frequently been referred to as a silent epidemic that is said to be quietly engulfing Australia. A culture of silence can mean that victims, as individuals, can feel too fearful or ashamed to come forward and report their experiences, while bystanders remain too uncomfortable or conflicted to speak out themselves. This might lead to the assumption that gender violence was similarly invisible in Australia's past, or that it has only been recently recognised as a social phenomenon. Our collection reveals that both of these assumptions are actually profoundly misleading. So today, I would like to offer you an overview of the aims and scope of our edited collection. Then to conclude, I will turn to my own contribution, which traces Australian feminist responses to gender violence from the late 19th century to the present, through the lens of print and digital culture. One of the central points of disconnect between these assumptions about gender violence and its historical realities is that media commentary rarely reveals the relationship between the present moment and the broader historical or cultural context. If the media and other commentators were to make these connections, this would reveal that contemporary cases are not merely outliers. That said, high-profile news stories about contemporary women who become the victims of crime does highlight some larger patterns. The 2012 disappearance and murder of 29-year-old Melburnian Jill Marr, for example, led to an outpouring of grief and frustration. Her death at the hands of a stranger led the media to characterize her ill fate as random, yet at least 2 other women had been threatened in the same public area in previous months. One had gone to the authorities on both occasions, but police pursued no follow-up or official incident report. The other woman did not view her own experience as serious enough to report until after Marr's disappearance. Marr's rape and murder might therefore be seen in terms of a confluence of factors, from the failures of the legal system to the extent of public apathy and cynicism towards violence against women. In contrast, the media often characterizes women of colour, migrant women, and the LGBTIQ community as culpable for their own victimization. The 2014 murder of Mayang Prasetyo by husband Marcus Volk is a case in point. The media quickly sensationalized the tragedy by focusing on certain facts surrounding the victim's life and death, and this will become quite graphic. First, the horrific murder involved Volk cooking Prasetyo's dismembered remains, and second, the 27-year-old was a Balinese transgender woman and a former sex worker. Brisbane's Courier Mail initially reported the case through sensationalistic headlines, which I'll move through quite quickly. According to criminologist Matthew Ball, the media turned Prasetyo into an aberrant object whose intimate life and tragic demise became the targets of fascination and titillation as much, if not more, than they could prompt public empathy. Another particularly arresting case was that of Ms. Du, a Yamatji woman from regional Western Australia. I'll now move to photographs that activists who used Ms. Du's image to draw attention to her case. In August 2014, after calling the police over her partner's violation of an apprehended domestic violence order, Ms. Du was herself arrested for fine default. Upon her incarceration, the 22-year-old had broken ribs and developing cases of septicemia and pneumonia. Days later, Ms. Du died in police custody. Both the police and health professionals had failed to properly attend to her medical needs because they believed that she was experiencing drug-related withdrawal symptoms. The CCTV footage, which illustrated the extent of this neglect, was shown repeatedly during the coronial inquest. However, her family's later request for this CCTV footage to be made public to reveal the depth of Ms. Du's suffering was in fact denied. As our edited collection demonstrates, connections between different types of violence frequently illustrate the complex underpinnings of gender violence. A victim of domestic violence in one circumstance, Ms. Du was callously rendered a victim of racist state violence in another. Such patterns are a direct challenge to the idea that Australia has arrived at a particular moment of crisis that seemingly appeared out of nowhere. These histories presented in our collection indicate exactly where these violent behaviours come from and how they have been rationalised over time to the detriment of women, children and men themselves. There is equally a failure to recognise that historic gains against gender violence have only occurred because of the willingness of some to stand against community complacency. Historians can reveal the socio-historic contexts that have allowed gender violence to flourish at the same time as highlighting eras where fast-paced change has been made. In 2015, for example, family violence campaigner Rosie Batty was appointed Australian of the Year. This brought greater attention to family violence in both the mainstream media and social media. Together with the launch of Victoria's Royal Commission into Family Violence, domestic and family violence have subsequently emerged as highly visible public issues. However, something of a disconnect between word and action remains. When the Royal Commission's 2016 report found that support systems to combat family violence were overwhelmed and that the frontline services continued to be cut, this signalled a tension between increased publicity on the one hand and ongoing denial and inaction on the other. The examples I've discussed so far, however, are very contemporary, most of them taking place in the 2010s. Notably, some of the backlash that has been recently experienced by those who do speak out about gender violence is shaped by the idea that there is a continuum of seriousness, which makes all but the very worst behaviours seem trivial. A historical understanding such as this continue to insinuate that society should resign itself to some level of gender violence as part of the human condition. How then, our collections ask, can histories of violence transform contemporary perceptions of gender violence in Australia? We suggest that historians are uniquely empowered to challenge this complacency about the inevitability of gender violence. So, when did historians actually begin to uncover these longer histories? Prior to the 1970s, very few historians had even considered the analysis of women's lives to be worthy of historical attention, often preferring instead to focus on the great men who were considered to have been the great historical actors. However, the burgeoning of feminist scholarship facilitated the beginnings of the gradual recovery of women's history across this decade. This occurred in tandem with a new generation of historical scholarship, which had a greater focus on social and cultural history as well as histories of everyday life. As more feminist historical scholarship began to emerge, historians started to discover a range of source material that detailed the everyday lives of women, including their experiences of family, sexual, and other forms of violence. As Zora Simic chronicles in the opening chapter to this collection, it is no coincidence that the 1970s witnessed a flourishing of Australian historical scholarship about gender violence. Influenced by women's liberation politics, early feminist historians such as Anne Summers and Miriam Dixon ensured that the historical significance of violence against women was being made visible for the first time. The national significance of gender violence was also explored, and conclusions suggested that colonial conditions had led to a particularly male-centred culture that exacerbated family and sexual violence, and that this continued into the 20th century. The dark side of mateship and the homosocial culture of the colonial frontier, these historians newly suggested, enabled a type of hypermasculinity to develop amongst white Australian men. These men, many of whom eschewed social characteristics that were considered to be feminine, helped incubate many of the attitudes which facilitated gender violence. The historical archive also yielded more source material than previously thought possible. This offered historians crucial evidence about the extent of the problem in previous centuries. For example, when historian and anthropologist Kay Saunders published her seminal 1984 article about domestic violence in Queensland, she commented that a surprising abundance of primary sources not only existed, but, in fact, revealed the extent of violence against women. Saunders made this discovery when she had been looking through court records on a completely different topic, only to be struck by the frequency of domestic assault cases that were being brought before 19th century courts. Despite these flourishing beginnings in the 1970s and 80s, the 1990s and 2000s witnessed more limited historical research about gender violence. The scholarship that did emerge was more narrowly focused in both scope and topic. Important work emerged from scholars such as Larissa Berendt and Lynette Russell, who reconsidered gender violence, not only from the perspective of white heterosexual women, but also from the perspective of women from different racial and class backgrounds and different sexual orientations. New analyses of settler colonialism and its legacies drew greater attention to interracial sexual violence and its role in enacting and perpetuating an imperialist agenda. And where earlier historians had focused on adult victims, contemporary disclosures about past child sexual abuse began to stimulate a considerable new literature about child victims. The attention that Australian historians have accorded child sexual abuse has been described by British historian Daniel Gray as absolutely pioneering. More recent scholarship suggests that historians are currently experiencing something of a renewed interest in gender violence. Analyses of criminal justice responses to family and sexual violence expanded significantly in the last few years, and this is a move that's driven by historians as well as legal scholars. Our edited collection is itself the product of an era of fast-paced change, as well as increased scrutiny and awareness about the reality of gender violence, both past and present. These contemporary interventions are not only desirable, but in fact necessary. Histories of gender violence cannot remain static because understandings of its meaning are constantly evolving. These changes are most evident in the evolution of the terminology that is being used to describe the phenomenon. As a 2007 edition of the Journal of Women's History recognized, the term domestic violence is actually of quite recent coinage, and it appears anachronistic if it's discussed before the late 20th century. This term had precursors in the 19th and 20th century, phrases such as wife-beating, battered wife, and violence against women. These shifts serve as an important reminder that gender violence has never remained entirely hidden behind closed doors, but that it has constantly existed as a contested part of public discourse. Although applying modern terminology and standards of behaviour to historical examples can create tensions, failing to do so can also normalise histories of violence. Moving away from euphemisms represents a more open acknowledgement of the problem, which enables a more comprehensive approach to finding solutions. Recent calls by sexual abuse and domestic violence support groups to replace the term victim with survivor serve as yet another reminder of the need to recognise not only women's oppression, but also their agency, an aspect that early feminist histories tended to overlook. Each of the chapters in this volume consider histories of gender violence in ways that are informed by current perspectives and knowledge. We actively seek to connect past with present in ways that will be useful to historians and other scholars, but also to practitioners, policymakers, and the media. I'll now give a brief overview of what is discussed in each section of the collection. This might seem a little bit disjointed, but I wanted to give a good overview of each of the contributors' contributions. The first section explores violence within the home. Some may be surprised about the extent to which wife-beating was acknowledged as a social problem in previous decades and even centuries. But then, as now, the motivation to confront the problem has been less forthcoming. One contributor suggests that the recent boom in genealogy and family history offers a means for breaking continuing silences about histories of domestic violence. Discovering examples of violence in one's family history can be incredibly confronting. At the same time, however, family history can reveal the personal and social legacies that past violence has had for so many Australians. Additionally, particular forms of violence were not even recognised as such until quite recently, perhaps even by the victims themselves. One such example is economic abuse. Economic abuse has increasingly been recognised as a form of domestic violence that encompasses a variety of behaviours. These behaviours include preventing a partner's access to shared financial resources, controlling their acquisition of independent resources, and refusing to contribute to household expenses or child-rearing costs. Such abuse undercuts the security and independence of victims. It often has the explicit intention of keeping victims within abusive relationships. However, little empirical research about the phenomenon actually exists. One chapter analyses economic abuse in 1890s Queensland, and it draws particularly on examples from Rockhampton. This illustrates how gendered power dynamics produce attitudes that are grounded in expectations about female dependency and submissiveness. The other chapters in this section reveal the degree to which family violence encompasses the whole family. It is essential to recognise that children can be rendered victims of gender violence by proxy. A lack of interventions into situations of family violence has the potential to erupt into other forms of violence, such as when children go on to kill their mother's abusers. This is further borne out by the analysis of incest, which reveals how unequal power relations between husband and wife, as well as between parent and child or parent and stepchild, can contribute to the enactment of incest. Another form of familial sexual abuse that became particularly controversial in the late 20th century was the issue of marital rape. The campaign to criminalise marital rape faced deep-rooted community beliefs about matrimonial hierarchy, These beliefs were grounded in the long-held legal principle that a wife should always be sexually available to her husband, and that a husband should not face prosecution for the rape of his wife. The assumption that activists had to counter in the campaign to criminalize marital rape was that a woman's consent became irrelevant in the matrimonial bed. The second section of this volume reflects on the historical, social, and political factors that render particular communities at risk, from the colonial frontier to the contemporary workplace. One chapter examines how white stockmen in the 19th century exploited Indigenous stockwomen for their sexual and economic labour, especially when Indigenous women became isolated from their kinship networks. Another chapter examines sex work from a historical perspective. It demonstrates that early 20th century attempts to abolish the sex trade failed to distinguish between women who had been trafficked unwillingly and women who were migrant sex workers. This was to the personal and financial detriment of women themselves, because migrant sex workers intended to immigrate with the view to pursuing sex work. State intervention has also rendered children the victims of gender violence. Since the 1990s, a series of governmental inquiries into institutional abuse against children have been held. This revealed the various forms of gender-based violence that occurred in institutional care across the 20th century, including at the Near-Cole Orphanage near Stanwell. This recognition is certainly a step in the right direction. However, future abuses will not be prevented until the patriarchal structures that underpin such violence are addressed, including the attitude that some children are less worthy than others. Following the histories of queer communities that began to emerge in the 2000s and 2010s, another chapter in this section demonstrates how lesbian women have also faced attitudes that serve to legitimate violence. Homophobia habitually leads to violence against queer people. The binary gender roles that defined some lesbian relationships during the 1970s sometimes led to silence when violence did occur within these intimate relationships. Now, turning to a space with which we are all familiar, the university, another chapter analyses how, when it comes to workplace discrimination, women in academia continue to experience many of the same dilemmas as their foremothers. This analysis of gendered microaggressions in the university offers insight into the types of insidious behaviours that continue to be faced by working women more generally. The third section turns towards histories of feminist activism against gender violence. Many individuals, including women's rights, but most especially women's rights reformers, have long sought ways to address violence against women. The state and the legal establishment have periodically expressed concerns about instances of gender violence, yet these institutions have also been reluctant to acknowledge any systemic problem in gender relations. One chapter reveals how the Australian feminist films of the 1970s became an important site for identifying gender violence. While the digital age has made it easier for activists to circulate information quickly, this has often made it more difficult to maintain community focus and actually get feet on the ground. This is a particular concern, given that other research suggests that many of the inroads that feminists made into the government approaches to domestic violence actually began to backslide in the early 2000s. The final chapter in the volume reveals both the benefits and limitations of engaging with government bodies with respect to domestic violence services and the provision of domestic violence services. The realization that gender violence is not just a feminist issue is increasingly being accepted. Historical knowledge can productively be used to illuminate the current national crisis. Explicit connections between past and present allow us to track changes and continuities that shape our understandings in examples of domestic, family, sexual, institutional, emotional, psychological, and structural violence. I will now turn to my own chapter, which is co-authored with Bridget Lewis. We explore the evolution of cultural attitudes towards gender violence. This transformation has been connected to how feminists have communicated their message to the public. As you've seen throughout this presentation, activists have always used posters to communicate messages about gender violence in its various forms, but they've also used newsletters, journals, and magazines and more recently have turned to digital initiatives such as social media. Our analysis reveals distinct differences between feminist responses to gender violence and that of the mainstream media and the government. Historically, gender violence has not been an essential concern for Australia's mainstream media. Between the 1870s and the 1970s, many newspapers published a section that was edited by a female journalist to capture a woman's perspective, but not necessarily a feminist perspective. During the 1980s and 90s, newspapers perpetuated stereotypes, endorsed common myths about gender violence and domestic violence, and often turned towards sensationalistic reporting. And arguably, as we saw in the earlier example of May and Crosetto, this approach from the media really continues unabated today. A more recent Australian government public education campaign, which many people might be familiar with actually, Violence Against Women, Australia Says No. This was a campaign that did acknowledge the severity of family violence. Yet, sociologist Ruth Phillips suggests that this campaign actually inhibited meaningful and transformative change. This was because despite the campaign's name, it actually used gender-neutral language across all its other platforms. The result was to downplay the predominance of men's violence against women. In contrast, women's rights reformers, suffragists, and feminists gradually developed a print culture that was deeply concerned with gender violence and its consequences. The violence of husbands against wives was a key concern for 19th century women's rights reformers. Interestingly, however, historian Jo Aitken argues that Australian suffragists actually seemed more reticent than their British counterparts to focus on examples of working-class husbands' violence against wives. After voting rights were extended to Australian women of European descent in 1902, most Australian suffragists preferred to describe wife-beating as a brutal relic of a bygone era. This meant that the question of violence against women actually appeared relatively infrequently in suffragist print culture at the turn of the 20th century. One notable exception to this trend was The Dawn, a women's rights newspaper edited by Louisa Lawson, who was the mother of the famous Australian poet Henry Lawson. Louisa Lawson published protests against drunken wife-beaters, specifically in the context of reforming Australia's divorce laws. However, despite the burgeoning attention that women such as Lawson were paying to men's violence against women, most feminist commentators overlooked settler colonial violence. Historians demonstrate that it was only in the 1920s and 30s that some feminists began to revise their previous attitudes towards Indigenous people and the effects of colonial dispossession. It was at this time that some women began to concern themselves with the situation of Aboriginal women, especially in the context of the Woman Christian Temperance Union's newspaper, The White Ribbon Signal. By the 1970s, feminists newly named domestic violence as a social issue. As Germaine Greer famously stated, women have very little idea of how much men hate them. In Australian women's liberation print culture, questions about sexual violence began to be discussed. This was initially with respect to the women's refuge movement, which emerged in the 1970s to offer crisis services to support women and children who were escaping situations of domestic violence. For other feminist activists, rape, especially in the context of war, emerged as a key issue. Feminist print culture constructed heart-rending emotional perspectives that focused on individualized responses to gender violence. Here is a case in point. In 1987, the Sydney Women's Liberation newsletter offered commentary about a detached report of an account of a young woman's murder that had been published in the newspaper. This had appeared under the heading, "She must be someone's daughter, sister, wife, killed." This prompted an impassioned letter, a powerfully moving epistle which is worth quoting at length. "They found your discarded body thrown over a rocky embankment, and as I read about you, a stranger, it is 3 weeks since you were murdered, and still nobody knows who you are. We know that you are female, blonde, with green eyes, that you are midway through your menstrual cycle. You have short, well-kept nails and shaved legs. We also know you recently had your hair cut and streaked, and that you have a small scar on the lower right side of your torso. We even know that you are a light smoker or a heavy coffee drinker. All those strangers handling and inspecting your body, and all those millions of strangers who have read the above personal and private details about you in the newspaper. What we also know is this: a man strangled and sexually abused you before and possibly after your death. Poor little sister, I hope you have loved ones who will ache for you as I do. Feminist print culture thus sought to humanize violated women in a way that the mainstream media did not. Anticipating the emotive response of many 21st century digital initiatives, this letter presented the unidentified victim in terms of herself, rather than as an extension of or in relation to the men around her. Since the early 2000s, the internet has become a site for activism, a mechanism for centralizing feminist concerns both locally and globally. Social media has been celebrated for its potential to highlight the intellectual strength and political edge of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a feminist sociological theory that was developed in the 1990s by critical race and legal theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. Rather than analysing women's oppression from the perspective of gender alone, intersectionality seeks to analyse the interconnections between different forms of oppression, especially those derived from gender, race, class, and sexuality. This framework has become one of the most important theoretical interventions to shape feminist theory and other feminist scholarship since the 1990s. As a result, intersectionality has come to bear great weight in feminist activism, especially digital activism. Social media users worldwide embrace hashtags to promote causes in response to contemporary events, often aiming to analyse the multifaceted causes of gender violence. This is amongst feminist activists. Some hashtags flourish nationally, while others interact with digital activism globally. Admittedly, however, trending hashtags often become most visible when publicised by mainstream media outlets. In Australia, the digital platform Destroy the Joint has become a noteworthy example of these trends. It emerged in 2012 after Conservative radio commentator Alan Jones claimed that women such as Prime Minister Julia Gillard were destroying the joint by daring to occupy positions of power and influence. The subsequent social media platform Destroy the Joint reveals how feminist campaigns can actively challenge the mainstream media. Addressing its adherents as joint destroyers enables these activists to invert the original slur and facilitate a positive digital community identity. In May 2014, Destroy the Joint launched its Counting Dead Women campaign. This campaign literally illustrates the extent of femicide in Australia by circulating memes featuring an ever-increasing death toll alongside a photograph of a weeping female statue. But even effective campaigns such as this can have their limitations. By focusing its activism around statistics that are scrutinised only by gender, Counting Dead Women largely fails to account for how gender violence disproportionately affects women of colour. What is changing, however, is that the internet offers a democratised social space in which Indigenous women can engage in their own self-representation. This means that activists can call each other out when their peers fail to apply the principles of intersectionality to their activism. To this end, Aboriginal activist Celeste Little's blog, Rantings of an Aboriginal Feminist, facilitates influential discussions about gender violence and intersectionality. Across 2015 and 16, Little intervened in the Counting Dead Women campaign by developing the counter-initiative, Counting Dead Aboriginal Women, on her blog and popular Twitter account. Every technological development and mode of communication has its benefits as well as its limitations. Social media connects activists on a level that was previously thought to be unimaginable. However, it also facilitates what media scholars describe as selective exposure, in that users are exposed to a relatively narrow cluster which can develop fragmented interactions and form divided groups online. Hence, the internet, while certainly allowing for new forms of activism, can also reinscribe some existing forms of exclusion. In addition, Issues of connectivity cannot be underestimated. Only those who have access to electricity, can afford to be connected, and are technologically literate can become engaged in the first place. And only those who are situated outside technologically restrictive regimes can safely and easily participate. Scholars rightly note that these differences cannot be wholly eliminated, even by feminists who are highly conscious of and committed to intersectionality. Some key threads can be identified across the print and digital responses to gender violence. Feminists of each era sought to humanize women and their experiences, emphasizing the personhood of women in the face of an antagonistic mainstream media. Increasingly, print and digital culture enabled women to develop connections between violence and other forms of gendered experiences. In spite of criticisms that suggest that online campaigns do not create real-world change and are merely limited to collectivism, the growth of online feminism has achieved substantive interventions. In comparison to earlier women's movements, where printing presses, greater financial funds, and a far larger labour force were necessary, the speed, ease, and low production costs of digital publishing is an important factor in the rapid dissemination of online content. Digital campaigns can and do prompt real-world change far more rapidly and cheaply than these earlier print technologies. The history of feminist activism against gender violence reveals the degree to which change has occurred across the 20th century. But it is equally pertinent to think about how much there remains to do, for activists and governments as much as for individuals. To conclude, this collection makes inroads into uncovering the many and varied histories of gender violence in Australia. Yet its compilation has also revealed gaps that remain in our historical understanding. For example, historical inquiry into questions such as transgender violence, disability abuse, elder abuse, emotional abuse, and criminal sentencing policies remains critical. Further analysis of the diverse experiences of Indigenous people, immigrants, refugees, and the stateless is also necessary in our current historical moment. And investigations of the experiences and perspectives of the perpetrators themselves can offer wholly new understandings of why these cycles of violence occur in the first place and why they're perpetuated over time. Additionally, the histories that seek to elucidate such a diversity of experiences in the past need to be mirrored in the present by an increased diversity amongst historians themselves. Gender violence in Australia, historical perspectives, provides an important step towards creating this greater historical insight into changing attitudes towards the nature of gender violence in Australia. Thank you.